In the quiet corners of the animal shelter, a heartbroken cat named Tommy kept crying, mourning the loss of his owner. The family, weighed down by their own grief, had left him there with heavy hearts, unaware of how his cries echoed through the lonely nights. One day, as a kind-hearted vet looked at the tag on Tommy's collar, a strange expression crossed his face. How could the family have missed this? Dr. Green slipped on his gloves and slowly approached the corner where Tommy was curled up, gently coaxing him with a few treats. He needed another look at that tag. As Tommy reached for the treat, Dr. Green read the tag again. "Oh my God," he whispered, and quickly called for one of his assistants. Had he seen that right? It wasn't just the name of Tommy's owner that stood out, but something else entirely. Mary, one of the vet techs, rushed into the room, her face filled with concern. "What is it, Doctor?" "Green?" she asked, glancing between him and the cat still huddled in the corner. "Yeah, are you sure the woman who brought him in said his last name was Carter?" Scott asked, confusion written across his face. "She said she was his wife." "Margaret," Mary replied, her brows pulled together. "And his name was Francis." "Why?" she asked, stepping closer, trying to understand why Scott looked so unsettled. "Because that's not what's on the tag," he said, still staring at Tommy. What name had he seen? And more importantly, what did it mean about who really owned Tommy? Dr. Scott Green had always loved animals. Even as a kid, he felt drawn to caring for them, though he hated that their lives were so short. Lately, he'd come to believe that maybe that was actually a gentler fate. When Margaret Carter brought in her late husband's cat, the poor thing looked crushed. Tommy had just lost his person a few days earlier, and according to the family, he hadn't stopped crying since. The family didn't really want to leave him, but they also didn't know how to comfort him. "He only ever listened to Francis," the older woman had explained, brushing away tears. "If we can, we'll come back for him." It was hard to watch, but Scott understood. In the middle of her own grief, Margaret probably didn't have the strength or time to care for the cat the way he needed. Dr. Green had brought Tommy to an open kennel and gently let him out of the carrier. The cat stepped out slowly and pressed himself against the wall, still crying softly. It was a hard thing to witness, but Scott knew there wasn't much he could do right then. He left the blanket inside the kennel so Tommy could have something familiar and returned the carrier to Margaret. Even though he hated leaving the cat like that, he still had to take care of a few things with her before he could do anything else. They signed the last of the paperwork, officially transferring Tommy's care to Dr. Scott. But Scott had no idea what kind of challenge that would become later on. If he had, he might have asked Miss Margaret a lot more questions about Tommy's past. For starters, Scott had never heard a cat cry and howl this much. While grief in animals wasn't unusual, this was something else entirely. It was deeper, louder, almost constant. "I'm going to check on Tommy," Scott told Mary, his assistant, still unaware of what strange thing he'd find. When he reached the kennel, he found Tommy with his paws pressed over his face. Scott crouched down, trying to spot if something was wrong. That's when he noticed the collar, still fastened tightly around Tommy's neck. "It's time to take that off," Scott said quietly, reaching gently toward the collar. But the moment his fingers touched it, Tommy let out a loud screech. Suddenly, the cat sprang up from his slouched position and bolted to the far corner of the kennel, hissing loudly as he curled up again. Scott froze, hands still midair, afraid he'd made it worse. "Why won't you let me take off your collar?" he murmured, confused. He'd also caught a glimpse of the tag, and something about it didn't sit right. "I must have read it wrong," he said to himself. He could have sworn he saw a name that didn't match what Margaret had told him. But right now, that wasn't the priority. Was Tommy in pain? Had something happened that he hadn't noticed? Scott slowly moved closer again, voice low and calm. "Hey, Tommy, "It's okay," he whispered, extending a careful hand. Tommy's eyes narrowed. Then, with a quick hiss, he swiped at Scott's hand, claws missing him by an inch. Scott pulled back immediately. Force wouldn't work here. This cat didn't need pressure. He needed someone who could understand him. Frustrated but still hopeful, Scott stood up and brushed off his pants. He had to try a different approach. Leaving the kennel, he thought about Tommy's reaction. This wasn't just grief. Tommy was guarding something. With a new plan forming, Scott made his way to the storage room. Maybe a gentler method would help. Tommy's cries echoed behind him, but when Scott returned, they had quieted a bit. This time, Scott had brought a small treat and a toy. "Let's try this again, buddy," he said with a gentle tone. He placed the treat just at the kennel's edge and slowly stepped back, giving Tommy room. Now it was a matter of waiting. Patience was going to be key. Scott sat nearby, watching as Tommy slowly crept forward. His eyes moved from Scott to the treat, clearly unsure. Finally, Tommy leaned in and sniffed, then cautiously took the treat. Scott didn't move. He just smiled quietly. This tiny moment felt like real progress. As Tommy began to relax, enjoying the treat, Scott started to talk softly, telling stories about the pets he'd had growing up. Little by little, Tommy's body eased. He started to uncoil, bit by bit. As Tommy's body slowly relaxed, Scott knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy. There'd be ups and downs, but moments like this, where a little trust started to grow, kept him motivated to help Tommy heal. Scott decided to try again, more focused this time. Tommy seemed a bit calmer now, but still didn't make it easy to get a clear look at his collar. It dangled just out of sight, the cat tilting his head as Scott adjusted to try and see it. Frustration and curiosity started to build. Why was this collar so important that Tommy got so worked up whenever someone touched it? Trying a new tactic, Scott held out another treat, just high enough to make Tommy lift his head. As the cat stretched upward, Scott caught another glimpse of the tag, and his heart skipped a beat. "Oh my God," he whispered, the shock clear in his voice. The name engraved on the tag wasn't what he expected. It changed everything. Without waiting, Scott called out, "Mary, can you come here?" His tone made her rush in, eyes instantly scanning between him and Tommy. "What's going on?" she asked, picking up on the tension. Scott's mind was already working through the puzzle pieces. "Do you know Margaret's full name? And are we sure their last name was Carter?" he asked quickly. Mary blinked, caught off guard. "I'll need to check the paperwork." "Why?" "What happened?" "That name," Scott said, motioning toward the collar. "It's not Carter." Mary's eyes widened. "Not Carter? Then who?" She stopped, suddenly realizing what that could mean. "I'll check right now," she said, spinning around and hurrying off. Whatever this was, it wasn't simple, and it was only starting to come together. Scott leaned in again, trying to read the faded letters on Tommy's collar. But it was tough, like trying to read something carved into a worn-out desk. The letters were faint and smudged. Tommy's movements didn't help either. He kept shifting to get to the treat, making the tag swing just out of focus. It was maddening. That collar felt like the missing piece, but Scott couldn't make out what it said. Mary came back, a file in hand, and a serious look on her face. "Yep, Carter, for sure. Margaret Elizabeth Carter Mason and Francis Antonius Carter," she confirmed. Scott's thoughts scrambled. That didn't match the collar at all. It was like trying to force a puzzle piece into the wrong spot. Something just wasn't adding up. Looking at Tommy, curled up and still guarding his collar, Scott felt a twist in his chest. That tag clearly meant something to him. It was like a child clinging to a beloved blanket. Scott stepped back, deciding not to force it anymore. He gently shut the kennel door, hoping Tommy would be okay for now. But Scott had other things to deal with. Back at his desk, he dove into Tommy's file like a detective chasing a lead. Every past clinic visit became a clue. There had to be something buried in those records. The next step? The Carters' home address? If answers were hiding somewhere, they'd be there. Scott grabbed his keys. He had to get the truth, whatever it was. He paused just before leaving, catching Mary and Yara's attention. "Heading out for a bit," he said. His voice was calm, but his mind was racing. "Ring me if anything comes up, all right?" he said. They nodded, used to Scott's sudden last-minute runs by now. With one last look to make sure things were fine at the clinic, he headed out, feeling like he was about to uncover something big. Sliding into his car, Scott entered Margaret's address into his GPS. That collar, it was stuck in his head like a puzzle piece that just wouldn't fit. As the engine started, so did his thoughts. They raced in loops, all circling back to that tag. What was hidden under those scratches? The farther he drove, the faster his mind spun. Why had someone gone out of their way to scratch off a name? What secret could be so serious it had to be erased by hand? His thoughts ran wild, imagining all kinds of scenarios. What if Tommy had a life before this family? A bigger story no one had told him? Each idea seemed more far-fetched than the last, but Scott couldn't shake the feeling. He pressed the gas a little harder. The urgency was real now. Thinking back, he realized Tommy had to be around 10 years old. But his file at the clinic only covered the past 6. That gap made everything feel even more mysterious. He had to know what had happened in those missing years. He had to understand who Tommy really was. Pulling up to the Carter house felt almost unreal. It looked like something out of a storybook. The mansion stood quiet and grand, like it had been holding onto secrets for years. Scott parked, heart beating fast, not out of fear, but from the thrill of finally getting closer to the truth. He walked up to the front door and knocked, driven by a deep need to get answers about Tommy's past. The door opened slowly, and a woman, definitely not Margaret, stood there. Caught a bit off guard, Scott quickly explained, "Hi, I'm here about Tommy, the cat." "I really need to speak with Margaret." There was hope and urgency in his voice, and he just hoped she wouldn't think he was some kind of weirdo. "Oh, Mom's not home right now," the woman said gently. She introduced herself as Margaret's daughter, and even though she was surprised, her tone was kind. "But maybe I can help?" Scott felt a bit awkward. This wasn't how he pictured the visit going, but it also felt like a chance he couldn't pass up. He hesitated, then asked, "Could I maybe look at some old family photo albums? From around 6 years ago?" "I'm trying to learn something about Tommy." It sounded strange, even to him, but Jane didn't seem put off. "Sure, that's definitely a different kind of request, but let's see what we can find," she said, motioning him inside. Jane stepped away to look for the albums, and Scott found himself alone in the grand entry hall. Everything around him was full of history. The silence, the polished floors, the tall ceilings, it all made him feel like he'd stepped into a time capsule. His eyes wandered until they landed on a large portrait of Frances. Something about it made him pause. It felt like the house itself was holding its breath, like the walls, the furniture, even the air had stories to tell. Standing there, surrounded by the quiet elegance of the Carter home, Scott felt strangely connected to the past. It was like just walking through that door had opened up a world full of things he hadn't expected to find. Still drawn to the photo, he stepped closer, studying the frozen moment in time, wondering what it might reveal. There they were, Margaret, Frances, and Tommy, caught in a warm moment of happiness. The photo showed them holding the cat close, and the love in that image said more than words ever could. Tommy's collar was clearly visible. Scott leaned in, hopeful he could finally make sense of the mystery, wrapped around the cat's neck. What really got him, though, was Tommy's expression in the photo. The cat looked peaceful, truly content, soaking up the affection from the people who had become his world. And now, frozen in this photo, the collar, the same one Scott had wrestled to read, was still and in focus. Without Tommy moving around, maybe Scott could finally read what was on that tag. The room was quiet, but in Scott's mind, pieces were starting to fall into place. The letters he could just barely make out didn't match Francis. Or Margaret. That only made the mystery more tangled and more compelling. Who was the name for then? Who did Tommy belong to before? Lost in thought, Scott jumped when the silence was suddenly broken. Jane was coming down the stairs, a photo album in hand. Relief and hope both hit him at once. Maybe the answers he'd been looking for were right there in that book. She paused partway down, her eyes settling on Scott. "Why are you so interested in that picture?" she asked, clearly curious. Scott blinked. He hadn't expected the question. For a second, he thought about making something up, but changed his mind. There was no point in hiding it. So, he told the truth. "I've just been really drawn into Tommy's story, especially how he's been since Francis passed," he said, rubbing the back of his neck. Jane's face softened, a touch of sadness flickering in her expression. "I'm really sorry for your loss, too," Scott added. It felt important to say it. Jane seemed to appreciate it. She set the photo album gently on a side table and walked over to the picture. "My dad found Tommy after he'd been hit by a car," she said quietly. "He was terrified. It took forever to calm him down." Scott listened closely. The bond between the cat and this family clearly went deeper than he'd realized. "Why didn't Francis just take him to the vet?" Scott asked, genuinely curious. Jane gave a small laugh. "Oh, he tried. But Tommy would bolt the second he got near the car. Hated it. It was just easier to care for him at home." Scott nodded. That made sense. Fear like that could make simple things nearly impossible. But then Jane said something that stopped him cold. "This was 6 years ago," she said, looking at the photo again. "He's been with us ever since." Scott's brain lit up. 6 years. That detail changed everything. The timeline didn't match up with what he'd assumed. Everything he'd guessed about Tommy's life before the Carters, it all got more complicated. But it also felt like he was closer than ever to understanding it. As they flipped through the album, Scott's eyes locked onto another photo of Tommy. This time, that same collar was front and center. "Has Tommy always had this collar?" he asked carefully. Jane tilted her head, thinking for a second, then nodded. "Yeah, he has." That small confirmation sent Scott's mind spinning. It meant the collar wasn't new. It was a link to Tommy's life before the Carters. Still following the thread, he gently asked, "Do you remember anyone who might have owned Tommy before your family?" Jane didn't hesitate. Her answer came quick. She shook her head, clearly puzzled, as they kept flipping through the album. Each photo showed a piece of Tommy's life with the Carters, but none gave a clue about where he came from before that. Then they came across a photo that stood out. In it, Tommy's tag was fully visible. No scratches, no damage. Scott's heart jumped. "Could I borrow this photo?" he asked, hopeful. "It might help me figure out how to help Tommy." Jane paused just for a second, then nodded, trusting him with the picture. On one condition: he had to bring it back. With the photo carefully tucked away, Scott thanked her and headed straight for his car. His mind raced with ideas. The name on that tag felt like a key, a way to finally help Tommy heal. The drive back to the clinic felt quicker than usual. Scott's focus sharpened with every passing mile. For the first time, the puzzle seemed like it was actually coming together. Pulling into the lot, Scott felt his determination surge. That photo might be the missing piece to everything, especially Tommy's deep attachment to the collar. The second he stepped into the clinic, Mary and Yara were already there, full of questions. Without wasting a second, Scott laid the photo out on the counter. "Look at this," he said, pointing straight to the name on the tag. As they leaned in, he quickly filled them in. Tommy's time with the Carters, the photo album, and his theory that someone else may have owned Tommy before. He told them about Jane's story, how Francis rescued Tommy, and how the tag, untouched in the photo, revealed something new. "It says Emily Harrington," he pointed out. "I think Tommy belonged to her before, maybe as a kitten." Mary and Yara exchanged looks, curiosity growing with every detail. Turning to his computer, Scott typed in the name, his fingers moving fast with anticipation. A profile popped up, Emily Harrington, just one town over, and the timing fit. It felt like something finally clicked. The story was lining up. Scott didn't wait. He found a phone number and dialed, his heart pounding a little harder than usual. Explaining the whole situation wasn't easy. He could hear the confusion in Emily's voice. "I think I may have a cat that used to be yours," he said gently. There was a pause, and then Emily agreed to come by, clearly curious and maybe even a little shaken. After he hung up, Scott felt a storm of emotions. Could this really be a reunion after all these years? The clinic filled with quiet energy. Mary and Yara offered encouraging smiles as they all waited for Emily to arrive. Every minute felt stretched thin, each one full of wonder about what might happen next. When Emily finally walked in, her steps were slow, uncertain. Scott noticed and greeted her with calm reassurance, easing her into what was clearly a strange moment. Together they walked toward Tommy's kennel. Emily stayed a little behind, unsure if this could really be happening. Scott gently opened the kennel door. Tommy had been yowling just a moment ago, but now everything went quiet. And then, when Tommy saw her, something changed. He paused, stared, then cautiously began to move closer. The room seemed to hold its breath. Emily knelt, slowly offering her hand. Her movements were slow, uncertain, but the moment Tommy sniffed her hand, something clicked. Recognition lit in his eyes. He leaned in and gently head-butted her palm, purring loudly in the quiet room. It was a moment of pure connection, beautiful, unexpected, and deeply moving. Emily, caught between shock and joy, couldn't hold back her emotions. Tears streamed down her cheeks as she reached out to him. Through the tears, she began to share the story of how she lost Tommy during a family move 6 years ago. Her voice trembled as she spoke of the endless search, the heartbreak of not finding him, and the painful decision to accept he was gone. Scott stood beside her, listening closely. It was impossible not to feel the weight of her story and the incredible twist of fate that brought them back together. But their emotional reunion was interrupted when Yara entered the room, her face serious. "Margaret Carter's here," she said, "and she's upset about the photo you took." The mood shifted. A quiet tension filled the space as they prepared to face what could be a difficult conversation. Scott and Emily walked to the front of the clinic, not quite sure what to expect. Margaret stood waiting, her face showing a mix of sadness, confusion, and hurt. As Emily and Margaret came face to face, the room seemed to hold its breath. But something unexpected happened. As they began to talk, the tension softened. What started as a complicated moment turned into something surprisingly warm. They shared stories about Tommy, about the years they'd each spent with him. Emily spoke of her childhood, how Tommy had brought her comfort and laughter before he vanished. Margaret responded with her own memories, how she and her husband had found Tommy, scared and injured, and how they'd cared for him ever since. With every word, their stories began to connect. What had once seemed like two separate paths now felt like one shared journey. It wasn't an easy decision, but it became clear. Tommy had two families who loved him deeply. After talking it through, Emily and Margaret came to a heartfelt agreement. Tommy would live between both homes, shared with love and care. It wasn't just a compromise, it was a choice made from kindness, understanding, and mutual respect. Margaret, still carrying the weight of her husband's passing, said she'd like to continue seeing Tommy after she had time to settle things in her life. Her words, though quiet, were filled with both sorrow and hope. It was clear she loved Tommy like family. Emily nodded, completely understanding. She welcomed the arrangement and promised to make space in her life for both Tommy and the connection he had with Margaret. Scott watched it all unfold with a full heart. He felt grateful to have been part of something so meaningful. What started with a crying cat in the back of a kennel had become a story of healing for everyone. If this story touched you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. It helps more people find stories like this, and you never know who might need one today. Thanks for watching.